Hello, I'm the Daily Storyteller, and I'm here to keep you company today. If you've visited my channel before, welcome back. And if this is your first time, I'm so glad to welcome you to the world of stories. I know many of you use these videos to relax or to help fall asleep more easily. So get comfortable, let your body relax, and allow the gentle sound of rain in the background to wash away your stress and worries. In this video, you'll hear chilling stories, most of them based on true events, told with honesty and depth. If you enjoy this content, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. Now then, let's begin. Story: The Forgotten Curse. It had been a long time since anyone had stepped foot in the old house at the edge of town. The faded wooden planks and rusted iron gate were all that remained of what had once been a thriving home. Now it stood abandoned, a hollow shell of memories, guarded only by the creeping vines and the whispers of the past. It was the kind of house people spoke about in hushed tones, a place surrounded by rumors where few dared venture. Samantha Moore had heard the stories all her life. Her grandmother would often speak of the house, her voice trembling as she recounted tales of strange lights in the windows, of doors that slammed shut on their own, of voices that called out from within the walls. "It's cursed," her grandmother would say, her eyes wide with fear. "No one should go near it." But Samantha was not one to believe in ghost stories. She was a woman of logic and reason, driven by the pursuit of truth. Her grandmother's warnings had faded into the background, buried under the weight of years and the realities of adulthood. Yet, something about that house had always intrigued her. Perhaps it was the mystery, or perhaps it was the fact that no one had ever dared to solve it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the town, Samantha found herself standing in front of the old house. The gate creaked as she pushed it open, and the air around her felt heavy, thick with anticipation. She hesitated for a moment, her mind battling the fear her grandmother had instilled in her. But curiosity won out. She stepped inside. The yard was overgrown, the once pristine garden now a tangle of weeds and wildflowers. The house loomed before her, its windows dark and empty, like the hollow eyes of a forgotten soul. Samantha felt a chill run down her spine as she approached the front door, which stood ajar as if inviting her in. With a deep breath, she stepped across the threshold, the door creaking shut behind her with an eerie finality. Inside, the house smelled of damp wood and decay, the air thick with dust that seemed to hang in the dim light. The walls were lined with old portraits, their faces fading with time, but their eyes, those eyes, seemed to follow her every move. Samantha wandered through the rooms, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The furniture was covered in white sheets, as though the house had been abandoned in haste. She felt an odd sensation, like she was being watched, but whenever she turned, there was nothing, just shadows, deep and foreboding. It wasn't until she reached the back of the house that she found something unusual, a small door, half hidden behind a curtain of ivy. The wood was old and warped, but it still held a strange allure. Samantha felt a pull, an unexplainable force drawing her toward it. She reached for the doorknob, and as her fingers touched the cold metal, she heard it, a faint whisper, almost too soft to hear. "Leave." The word echoed through her mind, sending a jolt of fear through her body. She jerked her hand back, her heart racing in her chest. Was it just the wind, or had someone, or something, spoken to her? With her heart pounding, Samantha decided to push forward. She twisted the doorknob and stepped inside. What she saw made her blood run cold. The room was small, almost like a closet, with walls lined with old books and strange trinkets. But what caught her eye was the mirror hanging on the far wall. It was large, ornate, and framed in dark wood, its surface cracked in several places. As she stepped closer, Samantha could see her reflection, but something was wrong. Her image seemed distorted. Her face appeared hollow, as though the life had been drained from it. Then she saw it. Behind her reflection, in the dim light of the room, a shadow moved. It was tall and thin, its form barely discernible, like a dark mist creeping into the edges of her vision. Samantha spun around, but the room was empty. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized something terrifying. The shadow hadn't been in the mirror. It had been in the room with her. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and the whisper returned, louder this time. "Get out!" Her legs trembled as fear gripped her heart. She turned and fled from the room, running through the house as fast as she could. But no matter where she went, it felt like the shadows were closing in on her, creeping along the walls, moving in the corners of her eyes. Every time she glanced over her shoulder, she could swear she saw figures flickering just out of sight, watching her, waiting. She reached the front door, her hand fumbling for the handle, but it wouldn't open. The door had locked itself. Panic set in as she pulled and tugged at the door, her mind racing. She could hear footsteps behind her now, slow and deliberate, as though someone, or something, was drawing closer. Then she heard it. A voice, cold and hollow, whispered her name. "Samantha." The voice sent a wave of dread through her body, and her hands shook as she finally managed to force the door open. She stumbled outside, gasping for air, her heart pounding in her chest. The cold night air was a relief, but the feeling of being pursued didn't fade. She turned around, expecting to see someone, or something, following her, but there was nothing. Only the house, standing tall and silent in the distance. Samantha didn't stop running until she reached her car. She fumbled for the keys, her hands slick with sweat, and finally started the engine. As she pulled away from the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The rear-view mirror reflected only darkness, but in her mind she could still see the shadow moving just out of reach. The drive back to her apartment was a blur, the events of the night replaying in her mind over and over. She couldn't understand what had happened. Had she imagined it all? Or had the house truly been cursed, as her grandmother had warned? The next day, Samantha returned to the library to research the house. What she uncovered made her blood run cold. The house had once belonged to a family, the Harringtons. They had disappeared mysteriously many years ago, their bodies never found. The only clue left behind was a cryptic letter, which spoke of a curse, a forgotten entity that had been awakened. The letter spoke of shadows that moved and voices that whispered, of a price that had to be paid. Samantha shuddered as she read the final words. The curse has not been broken. It waits for the next soul. She stared at the letter, her mind racing. The shadows, the voices, the mirror. It was all connected. And now, it seemed, the curse had claimed her. Days passed, and Samantha tried to shake off the terror that gripped her, but it followed her, always lurking in the corners of her vision, just beyond reach. The whispers never stopped, and she could feel the presence of the shadows, drawing closer with each passing day. She knew she couldn't escape. The house had marked her, and it was only a matter of time before the curse would claim her too. In the dead of night, she heard it again, the voice, faint but unmistakable. Samantha. This time she didn't run. Story. The shadow beneath the bed. Sarah had never been afraid of the dark. As a child, she would fall asleep with the lights off, imagining the shadows around her were her friends, quietly watching over her while she dreamed. But that was before she moved into the old apartment on Pine Street, a place she had been assured was perfectly safe by her landlord. The apartment was cheap, far too cheap for the area it was in. The walls creaked and groaned at night, as if the building was trying to speak. But Sarah dismissed it as the usual noises of an aging structure. She'd lived in similar places before. But there was one thing that kept her awake at night, a feeling deep in her gut that something wasn't quite right. It started small. The light flickering in the hallway, the faint rustling sound at the edge of her vision when she passed through certain rooms. Sarah told herself it was nothing. But then, one night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she heard it. A soft shuffle. Then, a thud. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze. The noise had come from beneath the bed. She tried to laugh it off, thinking it was just the old apartment settling, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was under there. Sarah pulled the covers tighter around her, the darkness pressing in from every corner of the room. She told herself it was just her imagination, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. The next day, she decided to check under the bed. Armed with a flashlight, she got down on her hands and knees, shining the beam into the shadowy space beneath the bed. It was empty, just as she expected. Yet the feeling of unease didn't fade. That night, she once again found herself staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The room was unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. Then she heard it again, the soft shuffle, the thud, followed by something else, a low, almost imperceptible whisper. "I see you." Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and she sat up, the covers slipping off her body. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she slowly turned her head toward the bed. There, in the darkness beneath the mattress, two glowing eyes stared back at her, eyes that were not human. Panic surged through her, and she leapt from the bed, backing away toward the door. But the eyes didn't disappear. They followed her every movement, unblinking, their pale glow cutting through the darkness like a beacon. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and the voice that accompanied them was not one she recognized. "You can't leave. You're mine." Sarah's skin prickled with cold as the voice sent shivers down her spine. She bolted for the door, her hand fumbling for the handle. The air around her seemed to thicken, pressing in on her, making it harder to breathe. She finally managed to yank the door open and rushed into the hallway, slamming it shut behind her. But the sense of dread remained, gnawing at her as she stood in the dimly lit corridor. She couldn't explain it. There was no way to rationalize the terror she felt. The eyes beneath the bed, the whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, everything felt wrong. She wanted to leave, to run far away from Pine Street, but something held her in place. A promise had been made, and it was clear that the thing beneath her bed wasn't going to let her go without claiming its prize. The days that followed were a blur. Sarah couldn't escape the feeling that something was following her, lurking just out of sight. She found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, hearing whispers in the wind that seemed to echo her name. The apartment, once a place of solitude and comfort, now felt like a prison. The shadows grew longer at night, and no matter how many lights she turned on, the darkness always seemed to creep back in. Every night she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the shuffle beneath her bed, waiting for those eyes to appear once more. And every night they did. Sarah knew she couldn't keep living like this. The apartment was slowly driving her mad, but every time she considered leaving, there was a part of her that felt trapped. The feeling that she could never escape, no matter how far she ran. It was as if the apartment had claimed her, and she was tethered to it, bound by an invisible force that held her in place. Then, one night, she woke to a sound unlike any she had heard before. It was a soft scratching, like claws dragging across the floor. Her heart raced as she looked toward the edge of the bed, but the space beneath it was shrouded in darkness. The scratching grew louder. Slowly, she lifted the blanket, her hands trembling. The eyes were back, glowing with a pale light. But this time, the creature beneath the bed wasn't hiding. It was waiting. A cold, wet hand reached out from the shadows and grasped her ankle, pulling her toward the bed. She screamed, but the sound was muffled, drowned out by the growling noise that filled the room. The creature's grip tightened, dragging her closer, its cold fingers digging into her flesh. As she was pulled under the bed, Sarah's eyes locked with the creature's, and in that moment, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The thing beneath the bed wasn't a monster. It was something much worse. It was her, a twisted reflection of her own fear, of everything she had tried to ignore, to suppress. It was the manifestation of the darkness inside her, her regrets, her guilt, her anxiety. It had been waiting all along, hiding beneath the bed, patiently biding its time until it was strong enough to take over. The last thing Sarah saw before she was dragged into the shadows was the face of the thing beneath the bed, her own face, staring back at her with hollow eyes. And then, nothing. Story: Nightmares in the Dark. David never believed in nightmares. At least, not until they became his reality. As a child, he had been terrified of the dark. The fear of something lurking in the shadows, waiting to drag him under, was a constant companion. But over time, that fear faded. He grew up, moved into his own apartment, and convinced himself that the monsters under the bed and in the closet were mere figments of a vivid imagination. He was an adult now, rational, logical, and nightmares didn't scare him anymore. That was until the night everything changed. It began on a cold, stormy evening. David had just returned from work, exhausted, looking forward to a quiet night alone. He pulled the blinds, shut the windows, and curled up on the couch with a book. The sound of the storm outside, the heavy rain and the howling wind, seemed distant, almost soothing, like nature was gently lulling him into a peaceful sleep. But sleep didn't come. It was around midnight when David first felt it, a strange creeping sensation. His eyes were heavy, his body sore from the long day, but there was something in the air that made him restless. The room was silent, save for the occasional crack of thunder, but that stillness seemed unnatural, oppressive. David sat up, his gaze shifting toward the hallway that led to his bedroom. There was nothing there, but the unease lingered. He shook it off, telling himself it was just the storm playing tricks on his mind. But then he heard it, faint, almost imperceptible, like the whisper of a voice from deep within the house. David. His heart skipped a beat, and he froze, staring into the darkness of the hallway. The voice had come from there, from the bedroom. He stood up slowly, his instincts telling him to run, to leave the apartment. But he couldn't. Curiosity pulled him forward, his feet moving before his mind could catch up. He stepped into the hallway, the darkness wrapping around him like a cold blanket. The air felt heavy, thick with something wrong. The voice came again, this time louder, closer. David. It was a soft whisper, but it sent a chill through him, freezing him to the spot. The door to his bedroom was ajar, the faintest sliver of light coming from within. He reached for the doorknob, his hand trembling as he slowly pushed it open. Inside, the room was exactly as he had left it, empty, quiet, save for the shadows that danced in the corners. But something was different. The atmosphere felt wrong. The air was thick with a presence, a weight that pressed down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. David turned toward the bed, his heart hammering in his chest. And then he saw it. A figure stood at the foot of the bed, its shape distorted, as though it was made of smoke and shadow. It had no face, only a dark void where its features should have been. The figure's form shifted unnaturally, like it was made of liquid darkness, constantly changing, never still. David tried to speak, to scream, but no words came out. His throat closed, his body frozen in place by the terror that gripped him. The figure tilted its head as if acknowledging him, and then it stepped forward. The floor beneath him seemed to pulse, the shadows stretching toward him, pulling at his feet. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. It was as if the darkness had wrapped itself around him, binding him in place. And then the voice came again. This time it was clear, cold, and full of malice. "You are mine." The figure reached out, its shadowy hand hovering just inches from his face. David could feel the chill of its presence, like ice cutting through his skin. His mind screamed for him to run, but his body wouldn't move. His vision blurred as the darkness closed in around him, suffocating him, and all he could do was stare into the void where the creature's face should have been. Everything went black. David woke up with a gasp, his body jerking upright in bed. He was drenched in sweat, his heart pounding, his breath coming in short gasps. The storm was still raging outside, the wind howling against the windows. But he was no longer in his apartment. He was lying in a bed that wasn't his own, in a room he didn't recognize. For a moment, panic seized him as he looked around the unfamiliar room. The walls were bare, the floor covered in a thick layer of dust. There was no sign of life, no sign of anything familiar. His clothes were still on him, but they felt strange, as though he had been wearing them for far too long. His mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened. Then he remembered. The figure, the voice, the darkness. He was still in it, still trapped in whatever nightmare he had fallen into. His body ached, his mind groggy, but the fear was still there, gnawing at him like a persistent presence, reminding him that he wasn't alone. Something was with him, something that had followed him from the dream. Suddenly, the door to the room creaked open, and David's blood ran cold. A figure stepped inside, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. It was him. The same shape, the same void where the face should have been. The figure walked toward him, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring every step it took. David tried to move, tried to scream, but the darkness pressed in on him, suffocating him, making it impossible to do anything but watch. The figure stopped in front of the bed, its presence overwhelming. It reached out, its cold, shadowy hand hovering above David's chest, and he felt a chill seep into his bones, paralyzing him. "You shouldn't have come," the figure whispered, its voice echoing in his mind. "You can't escape me." David's eyes widened as he realized the horrifying truth. The nightmare hadn't ended. It had only just begun. The figure leaned closer, its empty eyes locking with his. And as it did, David saw something that sent a shock of terror through him. The face he had once seen in the darkness of his own dreams was now staring back at him. It wasn't the figure's face, it was his own, and with that, David knew that he had become a part of the nightmare. It had claimed him, and now he would never escape. Story, the silent death. Clara had always been drawn to the old mansion on the outskirts of town. It sat on a hill, isolated from the rest of the town by a dense, overgrown forest. The house was a relic of a bygone era, its windows boarded up, its gates rusted shut. But despite its dilapidated appearance, Clara couldn't resist the pull it had on her. There was something about it, something unsettling yet intriguing, that made her want to know its story. The town's residents spoke of it in hushed tones, their words laced with fear and uncertainty. Some said it was haunted, cursed even, by the spirit of its last inhabitant, a man named Victor Blackwood, who had mysteriously disappeared decades ago. Others whispered that the mansion was a place of unspeakable horrors, a place where death itself lingered in the shadows. Clara, however, was not one to be frightened by idle rumors. She was a journalist, after all, and she prided herself on her ability to seek the truth, no matter how dark or twisted it might be. So, when the opportunity arose to investigate the mansion, she didn't hesitate. One autumn afternoon, as the sun began to set and cast long shadows over the landscape, Clara ventured up the hill toward the mansion. The air was thick with the scent of wet leaves and damp earth, and the silence around her was so profound that it almost felt unnatural. It was as if the forest itself held its breath, watching her every move. She reached the front door, her heart beating faster with anticipation. The door creaked as she pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty hallways. Inside, the air was stale and cold, and the faint scent of decay hung in the air. The floorboards groaned beneath her feet as she stepped inside, the house seeming to come alive with each movement she made. The walls were lined with faded portraits of long-dead ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow her as she walked through the rooms. The furniture was covered in white sheets, as though the house had been abandoned in a hurry. But there was something else, something more disturbing, something in the very atmosphere of the house that made Clara's skin crawl. She made her way through the mansion, exploring its many rooms, each one darker and more oppressive than the last. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of her footsteps and the occasional creak of the house settling. But as she ventured deeper into the mansion, Clara began to feel a growing unease, a sense that she was not alone. It was then that she heard it, a soft whisper, too faint to catch at first, but unmistakable. "Clara!" She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She spun around, but there was no one there. The whisper seemed to come from the walls themselves, the voice low and hollow, as if it was coming from somewhere deep beneath the house. She tried to brush it off, thinking it was just her imagination, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. She continued her search, determined to find the source of the voice. She made her way down a narrow hallway at the back of the house, the darkness pressing in on her. At the end of the hallway was a door, slightly ajar. Clara reached out to open it, but as her hand touched the doorknob, she felt a cold rush of air blow past her, as if something was waiting on the other side. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, but she pushed the door open, stepping into the room beyond. The room was small and dimly lit, the only light coming from a cracked window high up on the wall. There, in the center of the room, was a large wooden chest. It was old, covered in dust and cobwebs, but there was something about it that drew her in. She approached it cautiously, her breath catching in her throat as she lifted the lid. Inside the chest, there was nothing at first. Just darkness, thick and impenetrable. But then, as Clara peered closer, she saw it. Something shifting within the shadows. Something moving. Before she could react, a cold, clammy hand shot out from the darkness, grabbing her wrist with a force that made her cry out in pain. She tried to pull away, but the grip tightened, dragging her toward the chest. Panic surged through her as she fought to break free, but it was no use. The hand was too strong, pulling her closer to the inky blackness that seemed to swallow the room. "Clara?" The voice whispered again, this time much closer, as though it was right behind her. The air grew colder, and Clara could feel her strength fading as the darkness wrapped itself around her. With one last desperate effort, Clara wrenched herself free from the grip and stumbled backward, her heart racing in terror. She fell to the floor, her back pressed against the cold stone wall of the room. Her breath came in short gasps as she scrambled to her feet, her mind spinning with fear. But as she looked around the room, she realized something even more terrifying. The chest was empty. The hand, the voice, the presence, everything was gone. The room was silent once more, but the weight of something sinister still lingered in the air, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Clara stumbled toward the door, her mind racing. She had to get out of here. She had to leave before it was too late, but as she reached the hallway, she heard the whisper again, this time more urgent, more desperate. "Clara, leave!" She didn't look back. She didn't dare. The only thing that mattered now was escaping. She bolted for the front door, her footsteps echoing through the empty mansion. But when she reached the door, she froze. The door was shut, locked. Panic surged through her as she pulled and yanked on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as though they were all around her, closing in from every direction. And then, in the deepest part of the house, Clara heard it. A door opening, the sound of footsteps coming toward her. "Clara!" The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a scream. Clara's heart raced as she backed away from the door, her mind racing with fear. She was trapped. There was no way out. The footsteps grew louder, echoing in the silence of the house, drawing closer with each passing second. Clara turned, looking desperately for any escape, but the house seemed to close in on her. The walls, once silent and still, were alive now, shifting and groaning like they were closing in around her. She tried to open the windows, but they were sealed shut. The darkness pressed in on her from all sides, and the whispers, those horrible, haunting whispers, were growing louder, more frantic. Clara could feel them crawling under her skin, filling her mind with thoughts of death, of something ancient and malevolent lurking in the shadows. The footsteps stopped, and Clara held her breath, waiting for whatever was coming. She knew deep down that there was no escaping it. The house had claimed her, and now she was trapped. Then the door to the room creaked open. Clara didn't move. She couldn't. She was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. She could hear something, or someone, moving toward her in the darkness. And then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward. It was a man, tall and thin, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes were hollow, empty, like those of a corpse. His mouth twisted into a grotesque smile as he slowly approached her, the whispers growing louder in her ears. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered. "Now, you're mine." Clara's blood ran cold as the figure reached out toward her. The whispers filled her mind, drowning out everything else until all she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat. And then everything went silent. Story: Monsters of the Night. The small town of Black Hollow had always been quiet, a peaceful little community nestled in the valley between two towering mountains. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other and life moved at a slow, steady pace. But even in such a peaceful town, there were whispers. Whispers of things that lurked in the dark, things that nobody talked about in the light of day. For as long as Adam could remember, his grandfather had told him stories of strange creatures that roamed the woods at night. Monsters, he called them. "They come from the mountain," his grandfather would say, his eyes wide with fear. "And they come when the moon is full. You can hear them, their growls echoing through the trees. But never go looking for them, Adam. Trust me." Adam had never taken those stories seriously. He was a grown man now, and monsters didn't exist, at least not in the way his grandfather had described. But that all changed one fateful night, when Adam found himself alone on the edge of the forest, searching for a shortcut home after work. The sky had grown dark earlier than usual, the clouds thick and heavy, threatening rain. The trees loomed over him like silent sentinels, casting long shadows on the ground as the wind rustled through the leaves. He had just crossed into the woods when the first strange sound reached his ears. It was a low growl, so faint that he almost thought he imagined it. Adam stopped, his heart suddenly racing in his chest. He listened, straining to hear, but the growl was gone, replaced by the soft whisper of the wind. "Just an animal," he muttered to himself, shaking off the unease that had settled in his gut. But then the growl came again, louder this time, closer. Adam's breath caught in his throat as he glanced around, his eyes darting to the shadows that surrounded him. The growl was followed by something even more unsettling, a series of sharp, claw-like sounds scraping against the ground, the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush. Adam's pulse quickened, and he started walking faster, his footsteps quickening with his growing sense of panic. He could hear something following him, keeping pace just out of sight. The growl became a snarl, low and menacing, and Adam felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He had to get out of the woods and fast. His mind raced as he stumbled through the dense undergrowth, each snap of a twig underfoot sounding like a gunshot in the stillness. But every time he glanced behind him, there was nothing there. No creature, no shadow, just the dark expanse of trees. Yet the feeling of being hunted grew stronger with every step he took. Finally, he broke through the trees and into a small clearing where the moonlight shone down in a soft, eerie glow. Adam was panting now, sweat dripping down his face, but he forced himself to keep moving. He could see the lights of his town in the distance, just beyond the tree line. He was almost there, but then, just as he thought he was safe, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him, heavy and deliberate, closing in on him with every passing second. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned around, his breath caught in his throat. What he saw made his blood run cold. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a figure, tall and monstrous, with dark, matted fur covering its entire body. Its eyes were glowing with an unnatural yellow light, and its mouth was filled with sharp, jagged teeth that glinted in the moonlight. The creature's claws scraped against the ground as it took a slow, menacing step forward, its gaze fixed squarely on Adam. He could feel his legs tremble, the adrenaline rushing through his veins, but he couldn't move. He was frozen, unable to look away from the beast that stood before him. It was no animal, it was a monster. The creature growled low in its throat, the sound vibrating through Adam's chest. Its nostrils flared as it sniffed the air, its tongue flicking out like a serpent's. Adam's mind raced, but no rational thought could form. The creature was too real, too terrifying. With one last snarl, the creature lunged at him, its massive form moving faster than Adam could react. He tried to run, but the creature was already upon him, its claws sinking into his shoulder with a force that nearly knocked him off his feet. Pain shot through him as he fought to break free, but the creature's grip was too strong.
"Please!"
Adam gasped, his voice trembling with fear.
"Please, don't!"
But the creature didn't listen. It growled, its hot breath on Adam's neck as it dragged him backward further into the forest. He could feel its claws digging into his flesh, his skin tearing with every step it took. His vision blurred, the darkness around him closing in, but he refused to give up. He couldn't. He had to survive. With all the strength he could muster, Adam threw himself forward, pushing against the creature with every ounce of his being. He managed to break free, stumbling back onto the ground as the creature snarled in frustration. Adam scrambled to his feet, blood running down his arm, but he didn't stop. He ran. He ran like he'd never run before, pushing himself to the brink of exhaustion, the creature's growls echoing behind him. He didn't look back. Adam barely made it back to the town, his heart pounding, his body aching with pain and exhaustion. He stumbled into the safety of the streetlights, the familiar glow of the town filling his vision. He collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, his mind reeling from what had just happened. The creature was real. The monster was real. Shaking uncontrollably, Adam tried to make sense of the nightmare he had just lived through. He could still feel the burning claws on his skin, the crushing grip of the creature, but now as he looked around there was no sign of it. The town was quiet, peaceful, just as it had always been. Had it all been a hallucination, a trick of the mind? But then he heard something, a soft rustling in the shadows. Adam turned, his breath catching in his throat. From the darkness, two glowing eyes appeared, watching him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. The creature's yellow gaze locked onto his, and Adam felt his heart drop into his stomach. It hadn't gone away. It had followed him. The whisper of the wind seemed to carry a promise, a dark, terrifying promise that would haunt him forever. The monsters of the night were always watching. Story, the covered face. Megan had always been curious about the abandoned house at the end of Blackwood Street. Everyone in town knew the house, the one with the overgrown garden, the broken windows, and the front door that never seemed to stay shut. The house had been empty for as long as anyone could remember. Local legends said that the house was cursed, haunted by the spirit of a woman who had disappeared under strange circumstances many years ago. But Megan didn't believe in ghosts, at least not in the way the townspeople did. It was late one afternoon, just as the sun began to set and the sky turned an eerie shade of purple, that Megan found herself standing at the gate of the house. She had walked past it countless times, but today something felt different. The air was thick with tension, as though the house itself was waiting for her to come closer. She hesitated, glancing at the run-down structure. The windows, dark and empty, seemed to stare back at her. The door, partially ajar, creaked in the wind as if inviting her inside. Megan knew she shouldn't go in, but curiosity got the better of her. She pushed open the gate and stepped onto the overgrown path that led to the front door. The house groaned as she entered, the floorboards creaking under her weight. Inside, the air was stale, filled with the smell of dust and decay. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling in places, revealing the old wood beneath. It felt like stepping into a time capsule, frozen in the past, abandoned by everyone but the memories that clung to the walls. Megan wandered through the rooms, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and everything seemed untouched, as though the previous occupants had simply walked away one day and never returned. But there was something unsettling about the place, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. In the living room, she noticed something strange, a portrait hanging on the wall. It was an old painting, the kind that looked out of place in the modern world. The woman in the painting was beautiful, her face delicate and serene, but there was something wrong with the way she looked at the viewer. Her eyes seemed to follow Megan as she moved around the room, a knowing, almost sorrowful expression on her face. Megan's heart began to race, but she tried to shake off the feeling of unease. The woman in the painting couldn't be real, and the house couldn't be haunted. She wasn't about to let a little creepy painting scare her off. But then she heard it, a faint sound, like a soft shuffle coming from upstairs. At first, Megan thought it was the house settling, the wind rattling the windows, but the sound came again, louder this time. It was a slow, deliberate movement, like someone walking across the floor above her. Her pulse quickened, and she glanced around the room. There was no one else in the house. She was sure of it. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was upstairs, watching her. Taking a deep breath, Megan decided to investigate. She slowly climbed the stairs, each step creaking under her weight. As she reached the top, the sound stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The hallway stretched out before her, dimly lit by the faint glow of the setting sun. She felt as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for her to make her next move. At the end of the hallway was a closed door. The room beyond was shrouded in darkness, but Megan could see a faint light flickering from underneath the door. She reached out for the doorknob, her hand trembling as she turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dust-covered room. There, sitting in a chair by the window, was a figure, a woman. Her back was turned to Megan, and she was staring out the window, her face obscured by a veil that covered her head completely. Megan froze, her breath catching in her throat. The woman didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence. It was as if she didn't even know Megan was there. Megan took a tentative step forward, her heart hammering in her chest. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't respond. Megan hesitated for a moment before stepping closer, her eyes drawn to the veil that covered the woman's face. She couldn't see the woman's features, but she felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something was terribly wrong. Just as she was about to speak again, the woman slowly turned her head, and Megan's blood ran cold. The face beneath the veil was not human. It was a mask, featureless and smooth, like something sculpted from clay. The mask was expressionless, its eyes hollow and empty, and it was then that Megan realized the woman had been wearing it all along. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. It was the sound of breathing, shallow and ragged, coming from beneath the mask. Before Megan could react, the woman stood up with unnatural speed, her movements jerky and disjointed. The mask tilted toward her, and the breathing grew louder, more frantic. The figure lunged at her, and Megan screamed, stumbling backward into the hallway. The house seemed to come alive, the walls groaning and shifting, as if the very structure was trying to trap her. Megan ran, her feet pounding against the floor, the sound of her footsteps drowned out by the deafening pounding of her heart. She reached the stairs, but the woman, no, the thing, was already behind her, moving too quickly, too silently. Just as she reached the bottom of the stairs, Megan turned to find herself face to face with the figure again. The mask was now inches from her face, and the breath was so close that she could feel the cold air against her skin. Megan turned and fled through the front door, running into the night without looking back. Megan never spoke of the house again. She couldn't. The terror that gripped her during those final moments had been too much to bear. Her mind refused to process what she had seen, what she had felt. She tried to forget, but the image of that mask, the hollow, empty face, haunted her every waking moment. Months passed, and the town moved on, as towns always do. But for Megan, the nightmare never ended. She couldn't go back to Blackwood Street, couldn't bring herself to walk past the house again. The whispers in town grew fainter, but there was always one thing that stayed with her: the mask. It wasn't long before Megan learned that the house had burned down in a mysterious fire. The firefighters couldn't explain how the fire started, but they knew one thing for sure. The house had been empty for years, and no one had been inside when it burned to the ground. The townspeople said it was a blessing. The curse had finally been lifted. But Megan knew the truth. She had seen the mask. She had seen the woman, if she could even be called that, and she knew that whatever had lived in that house had never truly left. It had simply waited for the next person to come too close. And Megan knew deep down that it would never stop. The mask would always be out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for someone else to find it. Story: Unseen Creatures. The small town of Hollowbrook had always been the kind of place where strange things happened, but no one ever dared to speak of them. It was the kind of place where people lived their lives in quiet solitude, never asking questions, never digging too deep. There were unspoken rules here, rules that governed what you could and could not acknowledge, what you could and could not explore. It was in this quiet, eerie town that Jonah found himself, having just moved into a small cottage on the outskirts. He had come to Hollowbrook for peace and quiet away from the chaos of the city. But from the moment he arrived, something about the place unsettled him. It wasn't the house, which was small and charming, or the people who were kind, if a bit distant. It was the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the corner of his vision, something that was always there, watching him from the shadows. At first, Jonah tried to dismiss it. He told himself it was just his imagination, the result of moving to a new place, the isolation of the cottage playing tricks on him. But as the days passed, the feeling didn't fade, it grew stronger. It started with the whispers. Quiet, unintelligible voices that seemed to echo in the back of his mind. At night, as he lay in bed, he would hear the faintest scratching noises, as if something was moving just beyond the walls. The sound would stop when he got up to investigate, but every time there was nothing there, nothing except the silence that returned, even more oppressive than before. Jonah dismissed it as the sounds of an old house settling, but then there were the eyes. The feeling that someone, or something, was always watching him, even when he was alone. He would catch glimpses of shadows in the corner of his eye, figures that moved too quickly to focus on, disappearing before he could turn his head. It wasn't until one stormy night, when the wind howled outside and the rain lashed against the windows, that Jonah began to realize the truth. He was not alone. Jonah had been sitting at his kitchen table reading a book when he heard a loud thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against the wooden floor. His heart skipped a beat as he froze, his eyes wide in terror. The sound came again, closer this time, slow, deliberate steps that seemed to circle around the room, just out of sight. Jonah stood up, his hands shaking as he reached for the nearest flashlight. He flicked it on and slowly moved toward the sound, his pulse pounding in his ears. As he passed through the dark hallway, the temperature dropped sharply, a coldness creeping up his spine. He could feel the presence now. Whatever it was there, just ahead of him. The scratching continued, now followed by low growls, deep and guttural, like something hungry, something waiting. Jonah's breath caught in his throat as he rounded the corner and froze. In the darkness of the living room, something was moving. A shadow, taller than a man, was crouched near the corner, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Its body was covered in matted fur, and its limbs were long and thin, ending in sharp claws that scraped across the floor as it shifted. Jonah's heart hammered in his chest as the creature turned its head slowly, locking eyes with him. There was something human about its gaze, but something much darker too, a sense of malevolence, a hunger that made Jonah's blood run cold. Before he could react, the creature moved, its speed so unnerving that Jonah barely had time to jump back as it darted toward him. The flashlight flickered in his hand, the beam darting wildly across the room as he stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the furniture. With a scream, Jonah bolted for the door, throwing it open and running into the rain-soaked night. His mind raced as he ran, but no matter how fast he moved, the sensation of being chased, hunted, never left him. The growls of the creature echoed behind him, growing fainter as he reached the town's edge. But even as Jonah reached the main road, gasping for breath and drenched to the bone, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him still. The creature hadn't left. It was out there, in the shadows, waiting for him to return. The following days were a blur of confusion and terror. Jonah couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. He had seen the creature, and it had seen him. The memory of its glowing eyes haunted him, tormenting him day and night. And no matter how much he tried to tell himself that it was just some wild animal, something deep inside him knew the truth. The town of Hollowbrook had secrets, dark secrets that it kept hidden beneath layers of silence. As Jonah delved deeper into the town's history, he uncovered whispers of similar encounters, stories of strange creatures that had been spotted in the woods, of people who had disappeared without a trace, their bodies never found. The townsfolk were too afraid to speak openly about it, but Jonah could see the fear in their eyes when he asked. They knew. It wasn't until a week later that Jonah learned what the creature truly was. An ancient being, a monster that roamed the woods surrounding Hollowbrook, unseen by most but always present. It was a hunter, an apex predator, feeding off the fear and life force of its victims. It had been there long before the town was built, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next person to stumble into its domain. Jonah realized with a sinking feeling that he was now part of the creature's cycle. He had seen it, and it had claimed him. It wouldn't stop hunting him until it had drained him of everything. That night the whispers returned, soft like a breeze rustling through the trees, but growing louder with each passing minute. Jonah heard the growls again, closer now, the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against the ground. He bolted from his bed, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no escaping it. The creature was outside, circling his house, waiting. Jonah didn't look back as he grabbed his belongings and ran toward the woods, the very place he had been so terrified of just days earlier. As he ran deeper into the forest, he could hear it behind him. The creature's footsteps, its growls, its breathing, all closing in on him. He ran faster, his mind racing with the desperate hope that he could outrun it, that he could find a way to escape. But there was no escape. The creature was always there, always just a step behind. Jonah collapsed in the clearing, gasping for breath. The creature emerged from the shadows, its glowing eyes fixed on him as it stepped forward. Jonah knew then that it had claimed him. There would be no returning to Hollowbrook, no escaping the creature that had lived in the darkness for so long. As the creature moved closer, its claws reaching for him, Jonah's final thought was that the monsters of the night were not always what you could see. Sometimes they were the unseen creatures that waited in the darkness, patient and hungry, for the next soul to wander into their domain. And now Jonah had become one of them. Story. Whispers of the dead. Lena had never believed in ghosts. To her they were just stories, legends passed down through generations, invented to scare children into behaving or to explain the unexplainable. Her logical mind rejected the idea of spirits wandering the earth, trapped between life and death. But that was before she moved into the old Victorian house on Ridgeview Road. When she first laid eyes on the house, it had seemed perfect, spacious, charming, with a beautiful view of the valley below. It was everything Lena had been searching for in a new home. She had heard rumors about the house, of course. Every town had its haunted places, but Lena brushed them aside. Old houses had their quirks, their creaks and groans. It was all perfectly natural. But the moment she stepped inside, something felt off. The air was thick with dust, and the house had an eerie stillness to it, as though it had been waiting for someone to break its silence. The walls seemed to whisper, the faintest hum in the air, barely noticeable, but ever present. Lena dismissed it, thinking it was just her imagination. But as the days went on, that nagging feeling, that strange sense of being watched, grew stronger. It started with the dreams. At night, Lena would drift off to sleep, only to find herself waking in the middle of the night, her sheets tangled around her, heart racing, her body covered in cold sweat. The dreams were always the same. A shadowy figure standing in the corner of her room, its face obscured, but its presence suffocating. The whispers would start then, soft and indistinct, like voices carried on the wind, too quiet to understand, but too clear to ignore. Lena would try to call out, but no sound would come from her mouth. The figure would approach her slowly, the whispering growing louder, more urgent. Then, just as it reached her, she would wake with a start. Lena tried to tell herself it was just stress, that her mind was playing tricks on her. But the dreams didn't stop. In fact, they became more vivid, more terrifying. One night, she woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hall outside her bedroom. At first, she thought it was just the house settling, the old floors creaking. But as the footsteps grew louder, closer, Lena's blood ran cold. She heard a voice, soft and raspy, coming from just outside her door. Lena. It was her name, spoken in a tone that chilled her to the bone. Lena's heart pounded as she held her breath, the room feeling suffocatingly still. The footsteps stopped outside her door, and the voice spoke again, this time much closer. Lena, come closer. She didn't know what to do. Part of her wanted to call out, to open the door and see what was on the other side, but the other part of her, the part that was terrified of what she might find, told her to stay quiet, to stay hidden. So she stayed still, her body frozen in fear, until the footsteps faded and the house returned to its unnatural silence. The next day, Lena went to the local library hoping to find some answers. She had to know what was going on. The librarian, an elderly woman with a stern face, looked at Lena over the rim of her glasses when Lena asked about the history of her house. "You live at the old Whitmore house, don't you?" the librarian asked, her voice low, almost hesitant. Lena nodded. "Yes. I just moved in a few weeks ago. Is there something I should know about it?" The librarian's eyes grew shadowed, and she set her book down on the counter with a heavy thud. "It's a house full of ghosts," she said. "I'd suggest you leave before you get too attached." Lena raised an eyebrow. "Ghosts? I thought that was just a myth." The librarian sighed, her face creased with the weight of old memories. "The Whitmore family lived in that house for generations, but there was a tragedy years ago. The youngest daughter, Emily, she died in that house, and they say she never left. No one knows exactly what happened to her. Some say she drowned in the creek behind the house. Others say she was killed by her father, but no one really knows the truth." "Did the father—" Lena hesitated. "Did he confess?" The librarian shook her head. "He disappeared shortly after, leaving the house behind. But Emily's spirit remained. They say she whispers at night, calling out to those who will listen." Lena felt a chill run down her spine as the librarian's words sank in Emily. The name rang through her mind, a faint echo of the whispers she had heard in her dreams. She left the library, her head spinning with the strange information, and returned to her house, a sense of dread settling over her like a heavy blanket. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard it again, the whispers. Louder this time, clearer. "Lena!" She sat up, her heart racing. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the curtains. She could hear the sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, moving around the room. Her breath caught in her throat as she glanced toward the corner of the room. There, standing in the shadows, was the figure of a young woman. Her face was pale, her hair long and tangled, and she wore a simple white dress, the fabric hanging loosely around her thin frame. But it was her eyes that froze Lena in place, dark, hollow eyes that seemed to stare right into her soul. The figure raised a hand, and with it the whispers grew louder, more frantic. "Come closer." Lena couldn't move. Her body was frozen with fear, her limbs heavy, as if something invisible was holding her in place. The figure stepped closer, its feet gliding silently across the floor. Lena could hear her breath, shallow and ragged, as she tried to summon the strength to scream, to run. But the figure was upon her, its hand reaching out toward her. Just as the cold, clammy fingers brushed her skin, Lena snapped awake, gasping for air. Her heart was pounding, her chest tight with terror. The room was empty, the silence suffocating. She was alone. Or so she thought. When she looked in the mirror the next morning, she saw it, the faintest trace of a handprint on her shoulder, cold to the touch. It was then that Lena understood. Emily had found her, and now there was no escaping the whispers of the dead. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more persistent, echoing through the house at all hours of the day and night. It wasn't just in her dreams anymore. It was everywhere. At work, she'd hear her name called softly, carried on the wind, or when she walked down the street, she'd feel the cold breath of someone standing just behind her, only to turn and find nothing there. Lena tried to leave, but something always brought her back to the house. she'd find herself standing outside the front door, as if something invisible was pulling her in. The handprint on her shoulder never faded, and the whispers never stopped. One night, in desperation, Lena decided to confront whatever spirit haunted the house. She gathered a few candles and a lighter, lighting them one by one in the living room. She sat on the floor, her legs crossed, and began to speak out loud, her voice trembling in the silence. "Emily, if you're here, I want to help you. I want to know what happened to you." The room seemed to grow colder, and the shadows lengthened, twisting around her like tendrils of darkness. A gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles in an instant. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, surrounding her, filling her mind. "Lena." The voice was clear now, sharp and urgent. "Help me." Lena's breath caught in her throat as the figure appeared again, this time in the center of the room. But there was no hiding now. The face of Emily was clearer than ever, pale, haunting, her eyes wide with pleading, her lips moving as though trying to say something. Suddenly, the vision shifted, and Lena saw it. A memory that wasn't hers, but felt too real. Emily, standing at the edge of the creek, her face twisted in terror, her father's shadow looming over her. The scream that followed was not the scream of a child, but the sound of a woman desperate to break free. The house trembled, as if reacting to the memory. Lena knew then that Emily was not just a ghost, she was a victim. And whatever happened to her, the truth had never been told. With that realization, the whispers stopped, and in the stillness, Lena felt Emily's cold fingers brush her skin once more, this time in gratitude. The whispers would never leave, but now they were no longer demands. They were simply the echoes of a forgotten soul, still waiting for justice, still waiting for someone to listen. Story. The figure in the dark room. It had been a long day for Mark. Long hours at the office, followed by an exhausting drive through the rain-soaked streets. By the time he pulled into his driveway, the only thing he could think about was collapsing into his bed and finally getting some rest. But when he stepped inside his home, something felt off. His apartment, normally quiet and still, seemed different. The air felt thick, heavy, like something was pressing against the walls. He couldn't place it, but the unease settled in his gut. Mark shook it off, telling himself it was just exhaustion. After all, he had been working non-stop for weeks. But the feeling didn't go away. Mark walked into his bedroom, tossing his bag on the chair by the door. He rubbed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to relax. But something caught his attention. A shadow. It was dark, flickering across the wall, almost imperceptible, as if it didn't belong there. Mark turned toward it, his heart skipping a beat as the shadow seemed to shift. His breath caught in his throat. The shadow was too distinct, too unnatural to be a trick of the light. It was moving slowly, almost like it had a life of its own. He stepped forward, his mind racing, wondering if he was seeing things. But no. There, in the far corner of the room, standing just beyond the threshold of the darkness, was a figure. Mark froze, his eyes locked onto the silhouette. It was a man, tall, thin, with broad shoulders, and a presence so overpowering that it seemed to drain the light from the room. The figure was completely still, unmoving, but Mark could feel its presence as though it was somehow watching him. "Hello?" Mark's voice cracked in the silence. He felt ridiculous for speaking, but he had to break the stillness, had to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure didn't respond. It remained silent, its form shrouded in the shadows, standing just at the edge of his vision. Mark stepped forward again, his pulse quickening, his mind racing with possibilities. Could this be a trick of his tired eyes, a figment of his imagination? But no, this was too real, too solid. He could feel the weight of it, the way it seemed to shift in the room, like it was something more than just a man standing there. Mark reached for the light switch, his hand trembling, and flicked it on. The figure vanished. Mark blinked, his breath coming fast. He stood there, heart pounding in his chest, the room suddenly too bright, too quiet. The figure was gone, but the air still felt heavy, charged with an unseen presence. Mark swallowed hard, his mind scrambling for an explanation. Maybe he had imagined it. He had been tired after all. The day had been long, and the storm outside had only added to his exhaustion. But deep down, something told him it hadn't been a dream. The next morning, Mark tried to shake off the encounter. He convinced himself it had been a trick of the light, or perhaps some odd hallucination brought on by stress. But when he went into his bedroom to make the bed, his eyes fell on something that made his blood run cold. There, on the floor near the corner where the figure had been, was a single footprint. It was dark, as though it had been made in wet dirt, and the shape was unnervingly perfect, as though someone had been standing there, watching him. Mark's stomach churned as he backed away from the footprint. He looked around the room, but everything else was exactly as it had been. No signs of a break-in, no evidence that anyone else had been there, yet the footprint remained. And in the silence, he could almost hear it, the faint sound of breathing, just behind him. The days that followed were nothing short of unsettling. Mark couldn't get the figure out of his mind. No matter how hard he tried, the image of that tall, shadowy form, standing motionless in the corner of his bedroom, haunted him. Every night, as he tried to fall asleep, he would find himself glancing over his shoulder, expecting to see the figure lurking in the shadows again. But it didn't appear, at least not right away. It was a week later when Mark came home from work to find the apartment unusually cold. The heat had been on, but the chill in the air seemed unnatural, like the warmth had been sucked out of the room. His eyes immediately went to the corner of the bedroom. There, in the dim light of the hallway, he could just make out the silhouette of the figure again. This time, the figure was closer. Mark's heart leapt into his throat. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to move. The figure didn't shift or move toward him. It just stood there, unmoving, as if it was waiting for him to do something. "Who are you?" Mark whispered, his voice trembling. He couldn't tear his gaze away from the shadow. His hands were clammy, and his chest felt tight, as though he couldn't breathe. The figure didn't respond. It never spoke, never moved. But Mark could feel it now, the weight of its presence pressing in on him. His mind raced with questions. What was it? Why was it here? What did it want? Suddenly, the figure stepped forward, its movement so fluid, so smooth, that it almost seemed to glide. Mark stumbled backward, his breath coming in short gasps, as he tried to put distance between himself and whatever this thing was. But there was no way out. The door had locked itself. The figure reached out, its hand extending toward Mark. It was long and thin, like a shadow come to life. Mark's heart pounded as the cold fingers brushed against his skin. The touch was ice cold, sending a jolt of fear through him. "You don't belong here." The words were barely a whisper, but they echoed in his mind, filling him with an overwhelming sense of dread. Mark's entire body tensed, and he realized that the figure wasn't just there in the room with him. It was inside his mind, inside his soul, somehow connected to him. Without warning, the figure vanished. The room returned to its oppressive silence, and the coldness lifted, but Mark was left standing there, shaken to his core. That night, Mark didn't sleep. He couldn't. His mind kept racing, replaying the encounter over and over again. He knew one thing for certain now. The figure was real, and it wasn't done with him. The next morning, Mark called in sick to work. He knew he couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. But even as he packed his things, a thought gnawed at him. A deep, unsettling thought. Wherever he went, whatever he did, the figure would be waiting for him. And next time it might not just watch Story. Eyes that never blink. It was a small, unassuming town, tucked away in the rolling hills, a place where everyone knew everyone else, and secrets were hard to keep. Jackson had moved there only recently, seeking a quiet life after a messy breakup and the high-paced world of city living. The town was perfect for someone like him, peaceful, slow, and simple. At first it seemed like the ideal escape. The streets were lined with quaint cottages, each one more charming than the last. The town's center was made up of a few small shops, a bakery, and a diner that everyone seemed to visit at least once a day. But there was something strange about the place, a feeling that Jackson couldn't shake, no matter how much he tried to ignore it. It wasn't anything specific, just an oppressive atmosphere, as if something was always watching him from the shadows. It started with the eyes. At night, when Jackson would walk past the old boarded-up houses that lined the outskirts of the town, he would feel the distinct sensation of being watched. It wasn't the normal feeling of a person glancing at you, but something far more intense. Eyes that followed his every movement, unseen but always present. Sometimes when he was walking down the street, he'd turn around, half expecting to catch someone staring, but no one would be there. The first time it truly unnerved him was on a cold autumn evening. He had been taking a walk, as he often did to clear his mind, when he passed by the old church near the edge of town. It had been abandoned for years, its doors rotting, its windows shattered, but something drew him to it that evening. As he stood in front of the church, looking at its decaying structure, he noticed something that stopped him in his tracks. A pair of eyes, wide and unblinking, were staring at him from one of the broken windows. At first, he thought it was his imagination, the reflection of a streetlight or the moonlight playing tricks on him. But when he blinked and looked again, the eyes were still there, fixed directly on him. Jackson's stomach flipped, and he quickly turned and walked away, his pace quickening as he heard the faintest whisper, like the wind carrying a voice. "Watchful eyes," it seemed to say. That night he couldn't sleep. The image of the eyes haunted him, their cold gaze following him in every shadow, in every corner of his room. He kept the lights on, but it didn't help. He could feel them watching. The following days brought no relief. If anything, the strange occurrences only grew more intense. Jackson began seeing the eyes everywhere. In reflections on windows, in the dark corners of his room, even in the small objects around him. Sometimes it felt like the eyes were in the very walls themselves, staring from within, waiting. He tried to ignore it, focusing on work, forcing himself to go about his daily routine. But the sensation grew. The feeling of being watched didn't go away, no matter how many times he checked over his shoulder. And each time he returned to his apartment, the feeling would intensify, as if something or someone was waiting for him to walk through the door. It wasn't until the third week that Jackson began to notice something even stranger. Every time he looked into the eyes, whether in reflections, in dark windows, or in his dreams, their stare never changed. They never blinked. No matter how long he stared, no matter how hard he tried to look away, the eyes remained motionless, unblinking. One night, as he walked home from the diner, he passed the old church again. This time, he couldn't help himself. He felt a pull, an undeniable force guiding him toward the building. The doors were wide open, creaking slightly in the wind as he stepped inside. The darkness was thick, swallowing up everything around him. As he moved deeper into the church, his breath quickened. He knew something was wrong, but he couldn't bring himself to turn back. The air was cold, and his footsteps echoed through the silence. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. The eyes, they were everywhere, hundreds of them. Thousands. They stared at him from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, each one glowing faintly in the dark, their unblinking gaze fixed on him. He staggered back, his heart pounding in his chest, but there was nowhere to run. The eyes seemed to move with him, following his every step, closing in from all sides. "Why are you watching me?" he whispered, his voice trembling with fear. There was no answer, just the cold silence of the church. Then, as if the very building itself was alive, the whispers started. They were soft at first, like a breath in his ear, but then they grew louder, more distinct, their voices filling his mind. "We see you. You cannot escape us. The eyes are always watching." Panic surged through Jackson as he turned and ran, his feet stumbling over the uneven floor. But no matter how fast he moved, the eyes were always there, in every corner, every shadow, every reflection. They never blinked, never turned away. They followed him, relentlessly. He made it out of the church and back to his apartment, but the feeling never left. The eyes were with him. They were in his thoughts, in his dreams, in the very walls of his apartment. No matter how many locks he put on his doors, how many curtains he closed, the eyes were there, watching him, unblinking, unyielding. As the days passed, Jackson began to lose his mind. The whispers grew louder, and the eyes grew more vivid, more suffocating. His apartment became a prison, the walls closing in on him, the gaze of the eyes ever present. He could no longer sleep, could no longer eat, consumed by the relentless fear that he was being hunted by something that would never let him go. Then, one morning, as Jackson sat in his apartment staring blankly at the wall, he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the reflection of the window, in the glass of his coffee cup, he saw it. A figure, tall, thin, with glowing eyes, watching him from across the room. The figure didn't blink. And neither did the eyes. Jackson screamed, but it was too late. The eyes had found him. And now they would never let him go. Story. The Open Window. Emily had always loved the old house she had inherited from her grandmother. It was the last thing her family had, passed down through generations, a place of history and memories. The house, perched on the edge of a small town, had seen its share of years. Its wooden floors creaked with age, its walls held the stories of many lives, and the windows, those grand, wide windows, offered a breathtaking view of the rolling hills beyond. But there was one window Emily always avoided, the one in her grandmother's bedroom. It was the largest in the house, framed by thick velvet curtains that had long since faded. For as long as Emily could remember, the window had been kept closed, locked tight. Her grandmother had always been protective of it, warning her never to open it. "There's something out there," her grandmother had said on more than one occasion. Something that shouldn't be let in. Emily had never truly understood her grandmother's cryptic warnings. The house was old, yes, but it was a home, nothing more. Her grandmother had always been an eccentric woman, full of strange superstitions and odd rituals. Emily had dismissed the window as just another quirk of her grandmother's behavior, and when she moved into the house after her grandmother passed, she forgot about the warnings and carried on with her life. But the window haunted her. Every time she passed the bedroom, she would glance at it, feeling a strange pull, a curiosity she couldn't explain. One evening, after a long day of unpacking, Emily found herself standing in front of the bedroom door, her hand hovering over the knob. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound being the faint rustling of leaves outside, stirred by the wind. Without thinking, she opened the door. The room was dark, the only light coming from the fading sunlight streaming through the curtains. The window, grand and imposing, stood there, as if waiting. Emily hesitated for a moment, but her curiosity got the better of her. She reached for the curtain, pulling it back, and then she stopped. The window was wide open. Her heart skipped a beat as she stepped forward. She had definitely closed it earlier. She distinctly remembered it being shut. The chill of the evening air rushed into the room, carrying with it an unsettling whisper, like a voice just out of reach. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she slowly approached the window. It felt wrong, like something was off, but Emily pushed the thought aside. Maybe the wind had blown it open, she reasoned, or maybe her grandmother had left it open herself. But as she leaned out to look at the view, something caught her eye. A figure stood just beyond the tree line in the distance, too far for her to make out clearly. It was tall, almost impossibly so, with long, thin limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally into the sky. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring in her direction. Emily's breath caught in her throat, and she instinctively stepped back, slamming the window shut. Her pulse raced as she turned around, her mind racing. The figure hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound, but she could feel its presence, heavy, oppressive, like it was watching her. She shook her head, telling herself it was just a trick of the light. Maybe a tree had cast a strange shadow. Maybe it had been nothing at all, but deep down she knew it wasn't. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the figure again, standing in the distance, its eyes fixed on her. She pulled the blankets over her head, trying to block out the image, but it wouldn't go away. The next morning, she rushed to the window, determined to find some logical explanation. She opened it, carefully peering out, but the land beyond was empty. There was nothing there, no figure, no shadow, no sign of any movement. It was just the rolling hills, the quiet landscape she had seen 100 times before. But as she turned to leave, her eyes caught something on the windowsill. A small, twisted branch had been placed there, as though someone had set it carefully, just out of view. Emily froze. The branch wasn't there before. The days following the incident were a blur of confusion and dread. Emily tried to convince herself that it had been a mistake, a figment of her overactive imagination. She tried to ignore the strange feeling that clung to her, the sense that something was wrong with the house, with the land, with everything around her. But the more she tried to ignore it, the more it grew. The whispers returned, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves outside her window. Then they became louder, more insistent. They seemed to follow her wherever she went, always just on the edge of her hearing, always just beyond her reach. She couldn't escape them. At night, the figure came closer. Each time Emily looked out the window, she could see it more clearly. It was no longer just a vague shape in the distance. It was standing at the edge of the forest, staring at her with eyes that glowed like embers, burning through the darkness. The figure's limbs were long and gaunt, its skin pale and stretched tight against its bones. One evening, as she sat in her living room, the doorbell rang. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Who could it be at this hour? She wasn't expecting anyone. She stood up, her legs trembling, and walked cautiously toward the door. When she opened it, there was no one there. But there was something on the doorstep. A bundle of twigs, twisted and tied together, lay in a neat pile. The same twisted branch from the windowsill. Emily's blood ran cold as she stepped back, slamming the door shut behind her. She turned and backed away, her mind racing. The figure, the whispers, the branches, they were all connected. There was something about the land, about the house, that was drawing her in, something ancient and malevolent that she couldn't understand. That night, the whispers were louder than ever. They echoed through the house, seeming to come from every corner, from the very walls themselves. And through it all, Emily could feel the eyes of the figure on her, could sense its presence drawing nearer. She rushed to the window, her hands trembling as she pulled the curtains back. There, standing in the shadow of the trees, was the figure, closer than ever before. Its eyes were locked onto hers, and for the first time, Emily could see its face, a twisted, hollow visage, like something half-formed, stitched together from the remains of something that should have never been. The figure raised one long, bony finger, pointing directly at her. And then it spoke. "Come to me." The voice was low and guttural, like something not meant for this world. Emily's knees buckled beneath her, and she fell to the floor, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to run, to escape, but she couldn't move. The figure's eyes burned into her soul, and she knew in that moment that it wasn't just a thing from the woods. It had been waiting for her. Waiting for the right time to claim her. The window, she realized, wasn't just a window. It was a doorway. And it was always open. Story. The haunting in the woods. Tom had always been an outdoorsman. Hiking, camping, fishing. He'd done it all since he was a child, raised on the edge of a small town surrounded by dense forests and winding rivers. The wilderness was his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the noise of the world and reconnect with nature. But even he had his limits. There were some places in the forest that he knew to avoid, places the locals whispered about but never dared to enter. One evening, when Tom was in town picking up supplies for his next camping trip, he overheard a conversation at the local diner. Two elderly men were talking in hushed tones, their faces serious, their voices low. It didn't take long for Tom to catch snippets of their conversation about a particular part of the forest, an area that was off-limits even to the most experienced hikers. They spoke of it with such intensity that it piqued his curiosity. "It's the hollow," one of the men said, lowering his voice. "They say it's cursed. Strange things happen there. People disappear. Animals vanish without a trace. There's something wrong with that place. Always has been." Tom had heard the rumors before. The hollow was a stretch of woods that no one visited, not after dark. There were stories of lights flickering deep within the trees, sounds of footsteps when no one was around, and eerie whispers carried on the wind. Locals said that once you stepped into the hollow, the forest would claim you, and you would never return. But Tom wasn't the kind of person to let superstition control him. He had spent his whole life in these woods, and he had never seen anything that couldn't be explained. So, he decided then and there that he would venture into the hollow himself. He wasn't scared of ghost stories or legends. He was a skeptic, and if the forest had secrets, he was determined to uncover them. The following weekend, Tom set off with his backpack, a flashlight, and a sense of adventure. He entered the woods at sunrise, the morning fog hanging heavy in the trees. The air was damp and cool, and the sounds of birds and rustling leaves filled the silence. For hours he hiked through familiar terrain, the peaceful solitude of the forest washing over him. But as he ventured deeper, the atmosphere began to shift. The trees grew thicker, their trunks larger and more twisted, their branches tangled above him like skeletal hands. He reached the edge of the hollow by midday, and immediately something felt off. The air was still. There were no sounds of wildlife. No birds, no insects, not even the wind. Just an unnerving silence that pressed in from all sides. Tom hesitated for a moment, but then pressed forward, telling himself it was just his imagination. As he entered the hollow, the temperature dropped noticeably, and the forest seemed to grow darker despite the midday sun. The trees were massive, their roots twisting out of the ground like the fingers of some great ancient beast. The path he followed was overgrown, nearly impossible to see beneath the thick underbrush. He continued deeper into the hollow, but the further he went, the more the sense of unease crept in. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every time he glanced over his shoulder, he thought he saw a figure moving in the trees, always just out of sight. He brushed it off as paranoia, until he heard the first whisper. It was faint, barely audible at first, like the wind whispering through the leaves. But then it grew louder. A voice, clear, unmistakable, and human, calling his name. Tom! He froze, his heart skipping a beat. The voice sounded distant, but unmistakably real. He called out, his voice hoarse. "Hello? Is someone there?" There was no answer, only the eerie silence of the forest. Tom's breath quickened, his eyes scanning the trees around him, but there was nothing. He stood there for a long moment, wondering if he had imagined it. But then the whisper came again. "Tom, come closer." The voice was different this time, more urgent, more pleading. It seemed to echo from the very ground beneath him. Something about it felt wrong, unnatural, as if it was not meant for human ears. Tom's pulse raced as he began to move forward again, following the sound. He didn't know why he did it. Maybe it was curiosity, or perhaps he was just too far into the hollow to turn back. The trees seemed to close in around him as he moved deeper, their gnarled branches reaching out like claws. The whispers continued, growing louder, more frantic. "Closer, Tom! Come closer!" Tom's footsteps faltered. It wasn't just the voice now. The air around him was shifting, vibrating with an unsettling energy. He could feel the ground beneath his feet, but it felt wrong. As though the very earth was alive, breathing with him. Suddenly the whispers stopped. The forest fell silent once again. Tom stopped in his tracks, listening. Then the ground beneath him trembled. A low rumbling sound filled the air, like something large and heavy was moving through the earth. And then from deep within the hollow, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Not his own. Someone, something, was following him. Tom's blood ran cold as he spun around, scanning the trees, but there was no one in sight. The footsteps grew louder, closer. He could feel them, heavy, deliberate, as if something was stalking him through the woods. His heart pounded in his chest as he backed away, his mind racing. What was following him? Was it real, or had he finally gone mad in the depths of the hollow? As the footsteps grew closer, the air around him grew colder, and the shadows in the trees seemed to grow longer, stretching toward him like dark tendrils. He turned and ran, his legs pumping beneath him, adrenaline flooding his system. The whispers had returned now, louder than ever before. "You can't escape, Tom." The voice was everywhere, all around him, seeping into his thoughts, blocking out everything else. He could feel the presence behind him, growing closer, could hear the footsteps gaining on him. His breath came in short gasps, his chest burning with the effort to outrun whatever was chasing him. But no matter how fast he ran, the steps kept pace. Suddenly, he stumbled, falling to the ground. His flashlight flew from his hand, landing in the leaves with a soft thud. Tom scrambled to his feet, his hands shaking as he tried to catch his breath. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Turn around, Tom!" His eyes darted around the forest, desperate to find any sign of escape. And then he saw it. In the distance, barely visible through the thick trees, a figure stood. Tall and thin, its form obscured in the shadows. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but even from this distance, Tom could feel its eyes locked on him. The figure moved, its limbs unnaturally long, like something that didn't belong in the world of the living. Its presence radiated malice, and Tom's heart nearly stopped as he realized that the figure was not merely watching him, it was waiting for him. In a panic, Tom turned and ran, knowing that if he didn't make it out of the hollow, he would never see daylight again. The footsteps behind him grew louder, more frantic, but no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't escape. The figure was closing in, its eerie whispering filling the air. "Come closer, Tom!" His vision blurred as he pushed himself harder, the trees a blur around him, until he broke through the edge of the hollow. He collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, his body trembling with fear. But as he looked back, he saw nothing. The figure was gone. The whispers faded into the wind, but Tom knew in that moment that something had changed. The hollow had marked him, and he would never be the same. Whatever had been waiting for him in the woods, whatever had been following him, was still there, waiting for the next person foolish enough to enter. And Tom knew deep down that it would never let him go. Story. Cursed by the unknown. The town of Eldridge was a place that most people forgot. It wasn't large enough to be on any maps, and the few people who lived there were few enough to count on one hand. The streets were mostly deserted, the buildings old and sagging with age. It was the kind of town that seemed to have been lost in time, where nothing much ever happened, until the day Anne moved there. Anne had come to Eldridge looking for peace. She had just gone through a difficult breakup and needed to escape the clamor of the city, to clear her mind and find some space for herself. She had rented an old, isolated cabin on the edge of town, surrounded by tall, thick trees. It seemed like the perfect place to start fresh, a secluded getaway that would offer nothing but silence and nature. The first few days were blissful. She took long walks in the woods, sat by the creek, and read books on the porch. She found comfort in the quiet solitude that the cabin provided. But on the fourth night, things began to change. It was a cool evening when Anne first noticed something was off. She had just finished dinner, and as she cleaned up, she noticed a figure in the woods just outside her window. At first, she thought it was one of the locals, but when she looked closer, the figure wasn't moving. It was standing still, just beyond the tree line, watching her. Anne blinked, convinced it was her eyes playing tricks on her. She turned away, shaking off the eerie feeling that washed over her. "It's just a deer or something," she muttered to herself, trying to calm her nerves. She went about her evening, dismissing the figure as a figment of her imagination. But the feeling lingered. The next night, the figure was there again. This time, it was closer. Anne stood frozen, staring out the window as the shape, tall and thin, just stood there in the dark, watching. There was no movement, no twitching, no sign that it was a living creature at all, just an unsettling stillness. It was then that she noticed something else. There was a faint glow coming from its eyes, bright, unnatural. They were locked on her, and she felt them burn into her skin. With a trembling hand, Anne pulled the curtains shut and backed away from the window. Her heart raced in her chest, and her mind struggled to make sense of what she had just seen. But no matter how hard she tried to reason it out, she couldn't shake the fear that gripped her. The next few days passed in a blur. Anne tried to go about her daily routine, but the figure continued to haunt her thoughts. She never saw it again, but the feeling of being watched never left. Every time she stepped outside, she felt the same cold sensation creeping over her, a pressure, like something was lurking just beyond the trees, waiting for her. Then, one night, the whispers started. At first it was faint. A rustling sound, like the wind through the leaves, but it was too rhythmic, too purposeful. Anne would hear it in the silence of the night, a voice calling out in low, guttural tones. She could never make out the words, but she could feel the malice in the sound. "Who's there?" Anne called out one evening, her voice trembling with fear. But no answer came, just the silence and the growing tension that seemed to fill the space around her. That night, she decided to go to town. Perhaps she could speak to someone, find out if anyone else had noticed the strange happenings. She drove the short distance into Eldridge, the headlights cutting through the dark. The town was just as quiet as always, but there was something else in the air, a heaviness, an anticipation. As Anne walked into the small local diner, the bell above the door chimed. A few of the locals looked up from their meals, but when they saw her, their eyes quickly darted away. The waitress, an older woman with a weathered face, gave her a tight smile as Anne sat at the counter. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice clipped. "I was wondering if you knew anything about strange things happening in the woods," Anne asked hesitantly, her eyes scanning the room. The waitress stiffened. "You shouldn't be out there," she said softly. "None of us should be." "It's not a place for the living." Anne frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" The waitress sighed deeply, as if she was weighing whether to speak or not. "There's a curse in those woods," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's been there for generations. The forest, it takes what it wants. There are things out there that were never meant to be." Anne's blood ran cold as the woman's words sunk in. She had heard rumors before, local legends about the woods, but she hadn't paid them any attention. Now, something about the waitress's tone, her fear, made it impossible to ignore. There was a truth to her words that Anne couldn't deny. Before she could respond, a man at the back of the diner stood up, walking toward her. His eyes were dark, and his face was set in a grim expression. "Don't listen to her," he said, his voice rough. "You don't want to know about the things that live in the trees. It's better if you just forget about it. The woods take, and it never gives back." Anne stood up abruptly, her stomach twisting in knots. Something was very wrong here. She could feel it in her bones. She quickly paid for her coffee and left the diner, her mind racing. As she walked back to her car, she felt it again, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. And then the whispers returned. This time they were clearer, louder, as if the voices were right next to her.
Come closer.
Anne's heart raced. She whipped around, but there was nothing there, only the stillness of the night. She rushed back to her cabin, but the moment she stepped inside, the whispers grew louder. They echoed through the walls, through the floor, vibrating in her chest. Come closer. Come to the woods. Her breath hitched in her throat. The figure, the whispers, the cursed forest, they were all connected. Whatever had been waiting for her in those woods was now in her home, and it would never let her leave. As the shadows in her cabin stretched and warped, Anne realized one horrifying truth. She was already cursed, and there was no escape. The forest had claimed her, and soon it would come for her. Story: The Silent Watcher. Ella had never been afraid of the dark. As a child, she had slept soundly through thunderstorms, never once afraid of the shadows that crept into her room at night. But now, as an adult, she could no longer say the same. The fear she once shrugged off had crept into her life, a silent shadow that she couldn't escape. It started when she moved into her new apartment. It was an old building, but well maintained, with creaky wooden floors and high ceilings that gave it an air of age and charm. The kind of place she had always imagined living in, a little quirky, a little mysterious. But soon after Ella settled in, strange things began to happen. It started with the footsteps. At first, Ella thought it was just the building settling. After all, the walls were thin and the floors had a tendency to creak. But as the nights went on, the footsteps became more distinct. Late at night, she would hear someone walking down the hall outside her apartment. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, as though someone was pacing back and forth. At first, she would get up and check, but there was never anyone there, just the empty hallway, silent and still. Then came the whispers, soft at first, as though they were coming from behind the walls. Ella could never make out the words, but there was something unsettling about the tone. Low, almost inaudible, like a conversation she wasn't meant to hear. The worst part, however, was the feeling. It wasn't the footsteps or the whispers that unnerved her the most. It was the sensation that she was never truly alone. The hair on the back of her neck would stand up whenever she was in her apartment, especially at night. She would glance over her shoulder only to find nothing. But the feeling remained, a constant weight on her chest, a quiet presence watching her every move. One evening, after another restless night, Ella decided to confront whatever it was that had been haunting her. She waited until the building had fallen into silence, the other tenants long asleep. She sat in the middle of her living room, the lights dim, listening, and then she heard it. The footsteps. But this time they were different. They were closer. She could hear them clearly now, coming from the hallway outside her door. They were slow but heavy, like the deliberate steps of someone who was waiting for her to acknowledge them. Ella's heart pounded in her chest, and without thinking, she stood up and walked to the door. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob, her mind racing with thoughts of what, or who, could be outside. The footsteps stopped. Ella slowly opened the door, peering into the dim hallway, but there was no one there. She stepped out cautiously, her eyes scanning the shadows. The hallway was empty, just as it had always been, but then she heard it again, the sound of breathing, soft but unmistakable. It was coming from the stairwell at the end of the hallway. Ella's heart skipped a beat as she stepped toward the sound, her body tense with fear. The breathing grew louder, more frantic, as if something was waiting for her. And then she saw it. A figure. It was standing in the dark stairwell, just at the edge of her vision, its silhouette barely visible. It was tall, thin, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its face was obscured, hidden in the shadows, but Ella could feel its gaze on her. It was as though it was watching her every move, waiting for her to make the next one.
Hello?
Ella whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move. Ella stepped forward, her body moving against her will. She couldn't stop herself. She had to know what it was. The closer she got, the more the figure seemed to fade into the darkness, as if it was part of the shadows themselves. She reached out a hand, almost touching it, when a door slammed shut somewhere in the building. Ella gasped, snapping her attention to the sound. The figure in the stairwell was gone. In the blink of an eye, it had disappeared, leaving only the silence behind. She stood frozen in the hallway, her heart racing in her chest, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had it been a figment of her imagination? Or had she really seen something she shouldn't have? She backed away from the stairwell, slowly retreating into her apartment. The footsteps, the whispers, and the figure. It was all too much. She slammed the door shut behind her and locked it, breathing heavily. For the rest of the night, she sat in silence, her mind racing with the fear of what she had seen. The next morning, Ella tried to convince herself it had been nothing. She had been exhausted, overwhelmed by the stress of her new life, but the unease stayed with her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't safe in her own home. No matter where she went in the apartment, no matter how many lights she turned on, the feeling of being watched never went away. That night, Ella stayed awake, her eyes fixed on the door. She didn't want to sleep. She didn't want to close her eyes and risk seeing the figure again. But eventually, exhaustion overtook her, and she drifted off into a restless sleep. When she woke up, the room was dark. Her clock read 3:00 a.m. It was then that she heard it again, the footsteps, soft, slow, deliberate. They were coming from the hallway outside her bedroom door. This time, the sound was unmistakable. There was no mistaking it. The figure was back. Ella's breath caught in her throat as she sat up, her heart pounding. She heard the door to the stairwell creak open. Slowly, she slid out of bed, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. She crept to the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to stop, to lock the door and never look again, but her curiosity and fear pushed her forward. She opened the door just a crack, enough to peer into the hallway. And there it was, the figure. It stood at the end of the hall, just outside the stairwell, watching her with unblinking eyes. This time, it wasn't in the shadows. This time, it was closer, almost within reach. Ella's breath hitched as the figure slowly tilted its head, as though acknowledging her. It didn't move, but its presence filled the hallway, pressing against her chest, making it difficult to breathe. In that moment, Ella realized the truth. The figure wasn't just watching her. It was waiting for her to make a move, to open the door, to step into the hallway, and when she did, it would be too late. She would become part of the darkness, part of the thing that had been watching her all along. With a burst of courage, Ella slammed the door shut and locked it, her heart pounding in her chest. She backed away from the door, her eyes wide in terror. The footsteps stopped. The breathing stopped, the figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched never left. Ella never slept again. She never felt safe in her apartment again. The silent watcher had found her, and now it would never leave her. It was always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment when she would open the door again. And when she did, it would be her turn to step into the darkness. Story: The Forgotten One in the Dark. There were some things better left forgotten. That was the warning Ella had received from the elderly woman at the local antique shop when she bought the old mirror. It was a beautiful piece, silver framed with intricate carvings, its surface polished to perfection. Ella had found it tucked away in the corner of the shop, hidden behind stacks of dusty books and forgotten trinkets. When she saw it, something deep inside her told her she had to have it. It felt as though the mirror was calling to her, pulling her in with an invisible force she couldn't ignore.
Are you sure?
The woman had asked, her voice soft, almost a whisper.
It's an old piece. Not everything from the past is meant to be brought back into the light.
Ella had shrugged, not taking the warning seriously. She wasn't superstitious. She liked the look of the mirror, and she felt a strange connection to it, so she bought it without a second thought. The moment she placed it in her bedroom, however, things began to change. At first it was subtle. She would catch glimpses of herself in the mirror at odd angles, her reflection just a little off. Sometimes she'd swear she saw something move in the background, shadows shifting, or the corner of her mouth turning upward in a smile that wasn't hers. But she'd brush it off as a trick of the light, or the result of a long, tiring day. She didn't want to believe that something could be wrong with the mirror. But then came the dreams. Every night Ella would dream of the mirror. In her dreams, the glass seemed alive, pulsing with a strange energy. It would flicker, distort, and bend, as though the reflection was trying to escape its frame. The dream always ended the same way. She would wake up, drenched in sweat, her heart racing, only to find herself staring at the mirror in the dark room, its surface still and quiet, but somehow watching her. One night, as she lay in bed, wide awake after yet another unsettling dream, she heard a faint sound, scraping, like nails on glass. It came from the direction of the mirror. Ella's breath caught in her throat, and her body went rigid. She slowly turned her head toward the mirror, her eyes wide with fear. The reflection in the glass was different. It was still her face, but something was wrong, off. Her expression was twisted, contorted into a grotesque grin. Her reflection moved, not with her, but independently, like it was a separate entity. It pressed its face against the glass, as though trying to escape. Ella screamed and turned away, her heart pounding in her chest. She forced herself to look away, pulling the covers over her head. But the image of her reflection, the one that wasn't hers, burned itself into her mind. The next morning, the mirror was still in place, untouched. But Ella couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her. That night, the whispers began. They were faint at first, like a soft murmur just beyond hearing, coming from the direction of the mirror. Ella couldn't make out the words, but she could hear the tone, the urgency, the desperation. It was as if someone was pleading with her.
Please,
the voice whispered.
Please, help me.
Ella was frozen with fear. Her heart hammered in her chest as she sat up in bed, staring at the mirror. The whispers grew louder, more insistent.
Help me. Free me.
She couldn't stand it any longer. She had to get rid of the mirror. Ella didn't know why, but something inside her snapped that night. The mirror was no longer a beautiful antique. It had become a portal, a gateway to something dark and ancient, something that was clawing to get out. The voice, the reflection, the feeling of being watched, it was all too much. She couldn't live with it anymore. But when she tried to remove the mirror, it was as if something was holding it in place. She pulled at the frame, tugged at the edges, but it wouldn't budge. The glass felt cold to the touch, and her fingers tingled as though they were being repelled. Panic surged through her as she backed away, her eyes fixed on the mirror. It seemed to pulse, its surface rippling like water, and in the reflection she saw it. A figure, standing in the shadows, watching her with eyes that were not hers. It was dark, featureless, but there was a sense of movement within it, a presence that made her stomach drop. The figure stepped closer in the reflection, and Ella felt her breath catch in her throat. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was real, alive. She could feel its presence outside the mirror, reaching for her, as though it were trying to pull her inside. "Why won't you help me?" The voice came again, now closer, more desperate. "Please, you have to free me." Ella staggered backward, her legs shaking beneath her. She felt as if she was suffocating. The temperature in the room had dropped significantly, and she could see her breath in the air, coming in quick, panicked gasps. She knew she had to get away, had to leave. But the room felt smaller now, as though the walls were closing in. In the reflection, the figure began to step out of the mirror. Its form was still shadowy, but the more it moved, the more solid it became, until it was standing there in the bedroom with her, an unearthly presence that made her knees give way. "No, no, please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how to help you." The figure reached out its hand, its fingers elongating as they reached for her. "You do know," it hissed. "You always have." Ella screamed as the figure lunged toward her, its hand passing through the glass as if it were nothing. She stumbled backward, her body hitting the wall, and for one terrible moment she thought it was all over. But just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving behind an eerie silence. Ella sat there, trembling, her hands clutching the bed sheets, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She felt dizzy, as if the room was spinning around her. She glanced at the mirror one last time. In the reflection, her own face stared back at her, but it wasn't the same. It was the face of the figure that had haunted her dreams. The whisper returned, louder than ever before. "Help me." Ella didn't wait to hear the rest. She turned and fled the room, running down the stairs and out of the house, her mind a chaotic mess of fear and confusion. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay there, not with the mirror, not with the thing that had been watching her. The night air hit her face as she ran, the cold cutting through her skin. But no matter how fast she ran, no matter how far she went, she could still hear it. The whisper growing louder in her ears, a call she couldn't escape. "Help me." Ella didn't stop. She couldn't, because deep down she knew that whatever was trapped inside the mirror was still out there, still calling to her, waiting for her to come back. And one day it would find her.